This is AIM Agenda. With me now, Liberal Senator James Paterson and Labor frontbencher Matt Thistlethwaite. Gentlemen, good morning to you. Senator Paterson, welcome to the program, and newly elected as well. Congratulations on it. What's your feeling in relation to the census? Are you comfortable with the way that this is all being managed?
Yes, I'm very comfortable with it, Kieran. This is a very important document that completed by Australians. As Michael McCormick was saying on the program before, this provides really important, useful data that the government uses to make major policy decisions, and it's vitally important that Australians fill it out, and they fill it out accurately.
What about the issue of privacy? You've got Senator Xenophon, Senators Ludlam and Hanson-Young, Senator Paterson refusing to give their names, for example. They're worried about privacy breaches in the era of WikiLeaks and so on?
Well, I wonder if they refused to provide their names in previous years that the census was conducted, where it also required them to provide their names. As Michael McCormick pointed out earlier, the only thing that's changed, Kieran, is the length of time that the names are stored for. And as he explained, this is an important thing to help improve the quality of the data and improve the analysis we're able to conduct on the data. So I think this is a bit of a false concern on their behalf. There's nothing radically new or different about this census. It will hopefully be more efficient because it's being conducted online. It will be more useful because the data is being stored for a little bit longer, but the privacy concerns that they have this time, they should have had every previous time, and I don't remember them refusing to complete it then.
Let's have get the Labor reaction now. Matt Thistlethwaite, what's the opposition's stance on all of this? It's normally bipartisan when it comes to the census gathering of the ABS.
Kieran, the census is very important. It's probably the most important information gathering exercise that government undertakes, and it allows us to plan a lot of the delivery of services, particularly in health, education, aged care, closing the gap on Indigenous issues. It's very important. But our view is that the government has, like a number of policy issues, messed this up because they simply haven't supplied enough information to the Australian public. The responsible minister said yesterday that the concerns in the community were much ado about nothing. Well, I've been surprised by the number of calls that my office has fielded, particularly from elderly residents who haven't received their forms yet with their information key, or who don't have access to a computer and are forced to wait on the line for 45, 50 minutes to get information about how they get a paper copy of the census. So because you've had the chopping and changing of this government, we've had 3 responsible ministers over the course of the last year, they just haven't done the job in explaining the importance of the census and the changes that are being made.
But do you think, what's your view in terms of the criticisms that have been made about the census? For example, that names will be held for 4 years, and that there have been changes in approach, including a greater online entry option for people as well through the census. What's your take on the concerns that have been raised fundamentally? Do you think that they've got any merit?
I'm not as concerned about the privacy issue because, let's face it, most Australians transact on a daily basis on the internet. They'll either use Facebook or one of the social media sites. They'll use a Flybuys or a credit card to purchase materials and goods and services. So I'm not so concerned about the privacy issue, but what the government hasn't done a good job at, Kieran, is explaining why the ABS needs to keep that information for a longer period of time, and indeed the security mechanisms that will be put in place to allay a lot of those fears. As far as I'm aware, the security mechanisms will be top-notch. They'll be world-class. I think if we had a responsible minister out there explaining this, perhaps 12 to 6 months ago, you would have allayed a lot of those fears in the community.
Let's look at some other matters now. In the superannuation changes, you've got the Treasurer remaining very firm in terms of these reforms that were taken to the election. James Paterson, what's the level of concern that remains within the Liberal Party? I know some of your colleagues remain opposed to the changes, but the Treasurer, while he's saying there'll be a couple of exemptions, the bulk of the reforms will remain.
Well, Kieran, I think it would be premature to take a hard and fast stance on this just yet. The legislation is following the normal process of legislation. The Treasurer and his department are working on the exposure draft, which will be released in due course. It will then go to a government backbench committee where it will be examined and debated and discussed, and then the party room. Then it will go to the House and ultimately to the Senate, and there may be parliamentary committee inquiries throughout that time. So we've got a lot of road to run on this issue yet. It is by far from finalised. I think it would be very premature to declare one way or the other whether the government has gone sufficiently far in accommodating the concerns that some people have raised. I'm very relaxed about the process, and I think it's in good hands.
When it comes to the fundamental question, though, of whether or not this is a good reform, the Treasurer says that he's comparing it to basically changes to family benefits and so on, where people much less well off are having to lose benefits, that he's saying, well, this is an equity measure. What's your feeling on that? Do you think that's a fair enough argument?
Well, I think the reforms are rock solid in terms of their rationale. I mean, Kieran, by 2055, the number of Australians in retirement who are expected to be reliant on the pension is going to be 67%. That's only a 3% decline to the number of Australians who are reliant on the pension today. That means that 60 years after the introduction of compulsory superannuation, most Australians are still going to rely on the government in retirement, and I think that suggests that wholesale reform of superannuation was necessary. At the same time, we've heard throughout the campaign robust feedback about our super policy. I think it's important that we listen carefully to that and that we incorporate as much of that feedback as we can in the final package that we take to the Parliament.
Matt Thistlethwaite, obviously it's in Labor's interests to both major parties to deal with some of these reforms to make the savings necessary. And the truth is, when it comes to this issue, that Labor is almost lockstep with the government, except for one exception, that being that $500,000 post concessional contributions to super.
We understand the need for reform of superannuation tax concessions, Kieran. That's why we developed a policy, and we've had it out there for close to 18 months for the Australian public to see. The difference between Labor and the Liberal Party is that the Liberal Party is now in the midst of a civil war when it comes to this issue of superannuation. We saw that last night on Four Corners, the likes of Erica Betts openly criticising the Prime Minister and the government on this policy. Look, in terms of the announcement that was made by the Treasurer yesterday, we need to see the details. The details of this legislation haven't even been released to the public yet, Kieran. We haven't even seen a bill, an exposure draft. Sure, we've mentioned that we've got some concerns about the retrospective nature of it, and we've offered a solution there. We've said it should be put to an expert panel. But until we see the details, it's very hard for the Labor Party to make a judgment call on the details of this issue. But we do see the need for reform on tax concessions, and that's why we've put this policy out there of the Labor Party.
So Labor will be constructive. Obviously, the government's got a much more difficult scenario in terms of crossbenchers to manage. 11 crossbenchers in the Senate. It's going to be much more difficult than many would have anticipated before the election. Is Labor taking a constructive approach to this? Is that your sense of things as we enter the next Parliament?
Yes, we will take a constructive approach. We do see the need for reform of superannuation tax concessions, but what we do need to see is the details of this legislation. We've got a real issue with the retrospective nature of it, particularly in respect of the lifetime cap. Now, the government says that it's not retrospective. Well, it says in the budget papers that it's backdated to the 1st of July 2007. So we've offered a solution to this. If they're saying it's not retrospective, then put an expert panel together and get them to advise the government on the retrospective nature or not. We don't think that that's an unreasonable approach to take when you're talking about people's retirement incomes.
I want to ask you both about the opinion piece written by Michael Kirby, the long-serving and eminent jurist. He writes that Parliament is the place for dealing with same-sex marriage, not a plebiscite. I know, Matt Thistlethwaite, you'll agree with this, but James Paterson, he makes some valid points in today's Australian in relation to this, that it should be complex issues debated by our elected representatives.
Well, Kieran, the truth is that it has been. It's been debated at length, and in the last term of Parliament it was debated more often than almost any other piece of legislation or any other matter. It's been voted on many times, there have been various different bills. And although I understand why same-sex marriage advocates are frustrated that in that time it hasn't passed the Parliament, to say that the Parliament hasn't dealt with this issue I think is unfair. I think a plebiscite is a reasonable solution to what appears to be a parliamentary deadlock that we've had over the last few years on this issue. It gives all Australians the opportunity to have a vote, have their say on this issue, and I expect that if same-sex marriage advocates put their shoulders to the wheel and early enough in the process, then they'll have the outcome that they want. But continuing to fight the last war, trying to stop the plebiscite, I think is not the right strategy for people who want to see same-sex marriage legalised in Australia.
And while there are some quite profound legal arguments put by Michael Kirby, Matt Thistlethwaite, the bottom line is this is a popular measure as well. A clear majority of people support the idea of a plebiscite to resolve this issue.
Well, Michael Kirby is right, Kieran. The elected representatives should do their job and get on with putting this to the Parliament and having a legislative debate about it and making a decision. The other point is that James isn't right. There hasn't been a free vote in the Parliament. The Liberal Party has always locked its members into a position of opposing same-sex marriage. And if we had a free vote, a conscience vote in the Parliament, I and many of my colleagues are confident that this reform would be carried. We wouldn't need to waste $160 million on a plebiscite. We wouldn't have the vitriolic and divisive debate that we're no doubt going to get if this issue is put as a plebiscite. And Michael Kirby makes a very important point that we haven't had a plebiscite in Australia on a policy issue since conscription, so it's been close to a century since we've had to do this, and it's not the norm of representative democracy in Australia.
Matt Thistlethwaite, Liberal Senator James Paterson. Gentlemen, have a good day. Appreciate it. We'll
Thanks,
talk to you
Kieran.
soon. A quick break. Back
Thanks,
in just a
Kieran.
moment. Stay with us.